So we've got a powerful session about our children, and in many ways, our children beyond our reach. And as we have learned to do, is to have our moderator represent the generation that is coming, and coming in a powerful, powerful way. And I can't say that strongly enough, being here at this university. The students here are coming in a powerful, powerful way. And in many instances, they're ahead of us, and we're looking behind to see where they are. I've started looking in front of me, and that's where they are. And here's one of those that I look in front of to see where we're going. And Brittney Green is one of those students. She's our moderator for this session. Let's welcome her to the podium.
Good afternoon. I am Brittney Green, a junior majoring in psychology and minoring in business administration here at Tuskegee University. I serve as an executive board member for the Bioethics Honors Program. I have the pleasure of welcoming you all to our session, and I would like to thank everyone who is in attendance. The keynote speaker for this session will be Dr. Jacqueline Brooks. Dr. Jacqueline Brooks is a native of Tuskegee, Alabama. Dr. Brooks received her Doctorate of Education, Educational Specialist, and Master's of Science degree from Nova Southern University in Leadership and Instructional Technology, and her Bachelor's of Science degree from Alabama State University in Secondary Education. Dr. Brooks currently serves as the Superintendent of Education for Macon County Schools. She was named one of Macon County's top women of influence by the Southeast Small Business Magazine. She has also been appointed by Governor Bentley to both the Alabama State Board of Trustees and the State of Alabama Department of Archives and History Local Government Records Commission. Dr. Brooks is serving as the District 4 President of the Alabama Association of School Boards and represents District 4 as the 2014-2015 Superintendent of the Year. Please help me welcome Dr. Jacqueline Brooks.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon to this lovely audience that I have before me today. I bring you greetings on behalf of all of the girls and boys of the Macon County Board of Education, all 2,170 of them. Healing the family through social justice, the school, an extension of the family. Noted scientist, researcher, and scholar who once walked these very grounds, this campus of Tuskegee University, then Tuskegee Institute, Dr. George Washington Carver, declared education is the key to unlock the golden door of freedom. I dare say, if this is so, to whom has the key been given? So begs the assertion of today's topic, healing the family through social justice. Is the school really an extension of the family? Author and educational researcher William Jenkins stated, "I believe that great minds and talents have been equally dispersed among all races and cultures, and that educators have the great challenge to develop these minds wherever they may find them." To that statement, I fully agree. At this time in our American history, we see many conversations that say too few of those minds are being found and developed among Black children. Does it mean that those minds doesn't exist? Absolutely not. But this is especially true for those students who often live in inner cities, impoverished communities, and places like the Black Belt here in Alabama. Jenkins further utters that he fears that many people, some in education, some Black, and some white, have concluded that too many children, especially Black children, are incapable of the educational excellence that we see in mainstream children and with Asian children. And like Jenkins, I am convinced that this is certainly not the case. And I have seen enough evidence from students in Macon County, Alabama, here at Tuskegee University, and all over the world to know that there is great promise and hope in our Black and minority youth to be firm in the belief we are that all children can learn, will learn, when placed in an environment where the school is an extension of the home and students are in an environment that is conducive to and supportive of learning. To examine this position, we must first know what social justice is. The Center for Economic and Social Justice states that social justice is the virtue to guide us into creating those institutions and organizations where human interactions occur. In turn, these institutions must be justly organized and provide us with access to what is good for the person, both individually and in their association with others. Social justice also imposes on each of us a personal responsibility to work with others to design and continually perfect our institutions as tools for personal and social development. Looking at this definition then, at least in theory, schools should be the epitome of social justice because they are institutions and public education is considered a basic right of citizens and children in these United States of America. In fact, most of us and many term and view public education as the promise of a bright future. It was that great equalizer that led many of us here in this room today to the greatness that we desired and our families desired for us to have. We have built our careers and our success on the belief that hard work and going to school can change circumstances and outcomes. Public education is often heralded again as that great equalizer. So yes, I say to you again, school should be an extension of the home, and certainly as an educator who has spent more than 25 years in the field, I purport this to be my position. However, there are some concerns that we must look at with this particular posture. One, being an area of angst for me, is that social justice is not always supported or equal to economic justice. And too many schools, especially those that are in inner city, rural, often largely minority, or impoverished, are not well resourced, are often underfunded by legislative and governmental entities, and may be not making the educational process or progress that modern expectations or accountability formulas say that they should. According to a 2015 issue of the New York State Union of Teachers journal, citizens simply need to follow the money of economic justice, or I might say injustice, to see why public education, the social justice issue of our time, is under such fierce attacks. It is abundantly evident that corporations and hedge fund managers have a huge, greedy self-interest in public education. They are not really interested in whether or not our third grade children can read. They are not really interested in whether that second-year college student is being successful in these classrooms at Tuskegee University. Their interest often lies solely on the fact that they would like to put their fingers in the pool of money that goes into a public education system so that it can be an extension of the home. They only see profit to be made from privatizing schools and creating tests and curriculum that is often flawed, yet very, very lucrative. It is very necessary to paint schools as failing schools in order to sell tests and products that will be lucrative for many of these persons who claim to be proponents of public education. It is a fact that institutions, especially schools, because of this, often do not get the resources that they need because money goes to testing and other large firms that sell products that really are not designed to benefit our children. Therefore, schools end up grappling with survival issues and operating issues due to a lack of funding and financial stability, much in the same way as families in poverty struggle. Impoverished situations often don't allow schools to plan, extend, build, forecast, or impact families in the way that they should. The second consideration may be one that causes you to ponder for a moment and is not necessarily connected to the first consideration, and is a fine balance in the discussion that we're having today. And that is that often well-intentioned public education institutions, schools, programs, and other initiatives have been viewed as needing to replace the home rather than to support the home. I do believe that schools should be an extension of the home. I believe it should be in a support role. But the school is not, nor was it ever meant, to replace the home. Career educator Linda Madison stated, "It probably comes as no surprise that most research supports the widely held belief that the educational success of a child is very dependent on the family's involvement with and support for education and the school. In fact, most federal, state, and local public education goals have been recently edited to include a goal emphasizing parental participation. Plus, if we look at those schools that are often deemed by mainstream America to be successful, what do they have that other schools don't? A huge form of parental support and involvement. The old adage of needing a trinity to ensure successful children still reigns true in the majority of cases. And you probably know what those three tenets are: home, school, and community. And in some places, we can still get away with saying home, school, and church. So I will reiterate that while the school should be an extension of the home and the community must play their roles well in order for a family to truly heal. The Federalist paper published May 4, 2015 made this pretty bold assertion: schools that do everything that parents should do are not schools. They are orphanages. So we must be very careful about the role that we look at schools in when we say they are an extension of the home. Based on the fact that most politicians at the federal, state, and local level, as well as many citizens and members of our own community, are most often documented as saying they believe that public school is not doing well in the United States, when we know that sometimes this is a large myth, and therefore they do not believe that the school can play a role in healing the family through social justice. Why do people have this opinion that our public schools are not working? Why do we have barriers to schools being extensions of the home? I will examine several premises that must be taken into consideration and present each of them briefly. The first is a historical Supreme Court ruling from 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education. Many at that time thought that that was the be-all, cure-all, end-all of ills in public education, when the courts unanimously held that racial segregation of children in public schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. We immediately thought that all schools would be fully integrated, equal, and equitable. Some 50 years later, we see that this still has not been achieved in our country. The ability to legislate morality, equality, and equity has not come to fruition because, as well as many who were working to see it come to fruition, we had those working to see it not come to fruition. And all across the South especially, all white academies developed, and now today we have other movements, charter schools, home schools, and other crafty legislation to ensure that our public schools are not resourced in the ways that they need to be so that they can help families heal. One needs look no further than right here in Alabama, in our black belt of 12 counties. If you compare educational funding of these 12 black belt counties to funding received in places like Hoover, Alabama, Mountain Brook, Alabama, Shelby County, Alabama, you will see some of the hugest disparities in these United States of America that exist. This is still a huge concern and consideration as we look at the school being an extension of the family. A school that is not well resourced struggles to support the family in the way that it should. We can look at another example right here in the state of Alabama. From 2008 to 2015, public school teachers in Alabama received zero funding for classroom supplies. That may shock you. Zero. Zero funding for professional development. Zero funding for school library books, and zero funding for technology, with an average of $28 per student for a textbook. Is this social justice? I ask you. Where is the economic justice in that? Another consideration that we must look at is lack of a culturally relevant or Afrocentric curriculum. Prior to Brown versus the Board of Education, many schools focused on community values and culturally relevant issues. After integration, many of these culturally relevant focused activities, initiatives, events, programs, and curriculum fell by the wayside. From the work of culture researcher and educator, Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, we have gleaned that culturally relevant teaching requires that students maintain some cultural integrity as well as academic excellence. Beyond the set aside of 28 days of African American history in February, or a one-day celebration of Cinco de Mayo for Hispanic students, where is our cultural relevance in our American schools curriculum? Narrowing of the curriculum. For over a decade, it has been about reading and math only. And please don't mistake the fact that reading and math are super important. They are. But when we talk about healing families and the school being an extension of the home, it takes reading, math, and a whole lot more. There's the myth, of course, that the United States does worse in education than any other superpower country. Many programs that were in place to assist families, programs and initiatives designed to be an extension of the family, were sharply cut because of this myth. Programs like 21st Century Community Learning Centers were cut, Drug and Safe Schools funding was cut, Title V Innovative Program funding was cut. Everyone from President George W. Bush with the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 to nearly every politician and educator in America focused only on two subjects for students. Students were reduced to the drill and kill of math and reading only. When this happened, families, students, educators, and schools, as well as the greater community, suffered. We have now realized just how much we suffered by not paying attention to the other support pieces needed by students and families. Counseling service, extended school hours, more libraries, the arts. Slowly, it appears that we have been able to turn the tide to ensure that the complete needs of the child are met and just not one or two areas that have placed students in academic silos. We also have a very tunneled definition of parental involvement. Often we oversimplify it. We say parental involvement is simply a visit to the school, or we make it too complex and say parental involvement means that a parent needs to be at the school all of the time and serve as a quasi or co-school administrator. The Parent-Teacher Association outlines over 100 ways that parents can be involved in their children's education. And actually doing things as simple as reading the newsletter that a child brings home is a way to be involved. The other area is lack of value on academic success. Author William Jenkins, in his book, What's Missing in the Education of African American Children, The Real Reasons Behind the Gap, says school value must be the greatest community value that we have, the value on education. Then we have the millennial teacher, the teachers who now, after 1 year on the job, say, I can't do this. It takes too much and we don't have enough resources. Sadly, about 15% of our millennial and new teachers leave the job after 1 year. The percentage doubles after the first 3 years and goes up even more after the first 5. Finally, we must look at that school to prison pipeline. Someone came up with zero tolerance policies for our schools. And that meant for the least little things, such as having a nail clipper in a book bag, students, especially African American boys, were expelled from school, hauled off in the back of a police car, put in juvie, and thereby establishing their first encounter with incarceration. So rather than the school being an extension of the family, during this over a decade of time, the school became an extension of the penal and incarceration system. Where is the social justice in that? These are but a few of the factors that have intercepted the role of school as an extension of the home. Luckily, there are some things that we can do to ensure that the school is an extension of the home. Place value on education, hire qualified, caring, and competent, well-resourced teachers, hire the best school administrators we can find, and help our parents and community understand that their expectations make the school a better and more well-functioning institution. I leave you with this quote to contemplate, and it is by Brian Stevenson, the Executive Director of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. And he declares, the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice, social justice. Think about it. Thank you so very much.
Our first responder for this session will be Ms. Head, who is the chair of Voices for Our Father's Legacy Foundation, a nonprofit advocacy organization founded by descendants in 2014 to remember, celebrate, and honor the 623 men who were victims in the USPHS syphilis study. Ms. Head retired as a physical education and health teacher after 31 years from the Waterbury, Connecticut public school system. During her professional tenure, she was a coach, mentor, and advisor for her students and colleagues. She started her own educational consulting business in 1998 and worked for the Waterbury Public School System, Area Cooperative Educational Service, and Capital Region Educational Council. She is a graduate of the historic Tuskegee Institute, where she received a Bachelor of Science degree in physical education. Later, she received her master's degree in physical education from Southern Connecticut State University and her Master's of Science degree in Education Administrative Leadership from the University of Bridgeport. Ms. Head has received numerous professional and civic awards recognizing her leadership, educational initiatives, program management, and devoted service to the Waterbury community. Ms. Head.
Good afternoon. Acknowledging and honoring the presence of the Holy Spirit. Members of the speakers table, ladies and gentlemen, especially my family, Wilbert Head, my husband, Barbara Wiggins, my sister, Joyce Christian, my sister, my brother-in-law John Wiggins, my brother-in-law Will Christian, and my loving niece Melissa Wiggins. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You might wonder why I did that. We're talking about family, and family is where it all began. I deem it an honor and a privilege to have this opportunity to stand before you this afternoon. My presence here, along with other descendants, and if I could please ask all of the descendants, because you are my family, to please stand. Or raise your hand. We are here paying homage to the memories of the 623 African American men who were grievously wronged in the United States Public Health Service syphilis study in Tuskegee. As the daughter of one of these men, Freddie Lee Tyson, and having been raised in a poor family who held education in high regards, I have chosen as my topic to respond to Dr. Brooks' comments and to address the theme of this week's Public Health Ethics Intensive, Healing the Family Through Social Justice. My topic, the demanding roles of the family and the purpose of education. The most significant and important words in this topic are family and education. As a former teacher, administrator, and consultant for 34 years, I have come to realize how social injustices impact and affect the family. And one vivid personal example is the United States Public Health Service syphilis study. Before I begin speaking about the family, allow me a few minutes to share a short story about an extraordinary family. There was a little boy born a slave to a slave mother who was a single parent. He lived with his older brother and younger sister in a rundown 8x10 cabin. Every night, he slept on a pile of dirty rags on a dirt floor in one of the corners of the cabin. The little boy never knew the identity of his real or biological father, even though as a child, he was burdened with labor on the plantation from sunrise to sunset. Hunger pains were his constant companion. He, along with his father, his family, suffered dehumanizing conditions for the first 9 years of his young life. You would think that this child would have no aspirations or desires to learn, but be only thinking of surviving from day to day. Yet, he wanted to learn. He wanted to know what the letters meant and what the words stood for in the books he carried to school for his young mistress. He desperately wanted to go inside the schoolhouse that his mistress attended. He said once he felt that going inside this schoolhouse must feel much like getting into heaven. His longing to learn did not go unnoticed by his enslaved mother. Even though she had to cook 3 meals daily for 26 people, her prayers, love, caring demeanor inspired her son to dream of learning. Her prayers were answered in April of 1865, the day freedom finally came to her family. Soon after freedom, she found a school for her son. I can barely imagine how he must have felt when he walked in a schoolhouse on his first day. Work remained a big part of this young boy's life, but because of the encouragement and support he received within the family, particularly his mother, his teacher, and a few people within his small, impoverished community, both blacks and whites, he continued to work hard and was inspired even more to learn. This little boy was Booker T. Washington, one of the founders and the first president of Tuskegee Institute. It was within his family that he was inspired, found the courage and the strength to learn. How can today's family that endures daily hardships and social injustices, sufferings and pain are able to heal, survive, and strengthen? What can the family do? What demands or characteristics or attributes are necessary that will build a strong family and create an atmosphere for a person to learn, become a better person, and to help others to become better also? Today we bear witness to different family styles and even more daily social injustices and obstacles and challenges that confronts the family. And sometimes, without request, our troubles and misfortunes just seem to rain down in gallon buckets. But I don't want to focus on that this afternoon. My focus will not be on the paralyzing challenges and obstacles that often destroy or compromise the pillars of family life and hinder an individual from achieving their highest mentally, socially, and physically potentials and their fullest spiritual being. In every family, there should be relationships built on love, affection, service, gratitude, giving and receiving, mutual respect, teaching and learning, helping and sharing, trusting and confiding, believing and hoping. It is in the home that we first learn the meaning of moral support, reassurance in times of doubt, comforting in times of sorrow, encouragement in the face of uncertainty, and consolation in the face of calamity. Character and self-discipline began developing in the family. Self-worth and the worth of others, moral values and ethics began forming in the family. Spiritual life and a person's faith journey begins at home. These demands on any family are necessary, especially in times when we feel that they are out of reach. In spite of their inhumane treatment in this study, I'm sure the men must have felt the same way. But they had the characteristics and the demands from their families. They were able to forgive, to heal, and left it up to their descendants to transform and uplift the legacy of the United States Public Health Syphilis Study. The descendants have formed, as you have heard, Voices for Our Fathers Legacy Foundation, and it is a nonprofit, as you have also heard. And because of their strength, because of our healing, because of our family, we were able on Monday to take that first step, a historical trip, to actually see the records of our fathers and those terrible pictures that were taken of them. Our goal, our purpose, our responsibility as a family is to change the narrative of the story. Every day we hear about, read about, or experience firsthand the failure of our educational system and how we are failing our children. We hear calls and demands for better schools and better teachers. Our educational system, and if we're to change this, as Dr. Brooks have mentioned, the change will begin at home, starting at home with the family. It must begin there. The home is the first place children become curious about the world, show interest in learning, touching, listening, observing, and emulating the examples of their parents. These beginnings shape and mold attitudes and behaviors that will be used when they relate, associate, and operate as an adult in different cultures within our society. I believe our most important purpose in this life is to work every day, striving to ensure that we live up to the demands of the family. By doing this, we will create a positive attitude and space that will provide a place for healing, learning, and becoming a better human being. As a mother and grandmother, I feel an enormous responsibility to continue to strengthen and maintain my precious family bonds by sharing past experiences, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And also by sharing the little wisdom that I have acquired with younger generations, just as my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents and countless other family members have done before. One story that must be passed on is the story of the United States Public Health Syphilis Study. We must tell the untold story of our fathers. In my humble view, the family is the soul of the society, and education is the heart. Some form of education was documented over 3,500 years ago in Greece. It has been an integral part of our civilization for thousands of years. Education is progressive. It has enabled human beings generation after generation to become more aware and knowledgeable about the world in which we live. And have better provided us with an understanding about the people we share this world with. The primary purpose of education is to make us a better people. Education provides us with freedom to make wise choices, to acquire knowledge, become independent thinkers, capable of making rational and moral decisions, and how to treat all of mankind with dignity and respect. Education allows individuals to have a better job opportunities, financial stability, and become leaders and acquire esteemed social status within their community as a good citizen. The word education comes from the Latin word educere, meaning to lead. Hearing the origin of the word, we must be reminded of the reason Booker T. Washington came to Tuskegee after receiving a stellar education from Hampton University. Am I over? Hampton University with honors and heading up a school to educate some of our Native Americans. He was called by Lewis Adams and others to come from Virginia, which is where I'm from, and start a school in rural Tuskegee, Alabama, to help educate the poor former African-American slave and their children in this small community. Just 16 years after slavery had ended, this young enslaved boy had become educated and willing to use his education to lead others in his race into their new worlds and teach them the knowledge needed to have a better life. Booker T. Washington's teaching was not just limited to the grounds of Tuskegee campus, but he reached out with his model Rosenwald schools to the poor neighborhoods and counties around Macon County. And I must say, as I remember my mom and dad telling me at one time during these times in the early 20th century, Tuskegee was the place to be for your education. It was there. And it is my dream that one day Tuskegee will be again the place for education, the model for the world. I think we all will agree that education is the most powerful tool necessary for strengthening families and eliminating social justice. And within strong families, you build strong individuals. And strong individuals develop strong communities. And strong communities will make strong nations. And strong nations will create a better world. I will close my remarks on education by reading an article from the Morehouse, were the Morehouse people still here? College student paper, published in 1947, and written none other than by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And it was entitled The Purpose of Education. And he says, as I engage in the so-called bull sessions around and about the school, I too often find most college men have a misconception of the purpose of education. Most of the brethren think that education should equip them with proper instruments of exploitation so that they can forever trample over the masses. Still others think that education should furnish them with noble ends rather than means to an end. It seems to me that education has a twofold function: to perform in the life of man and in society. The one is utility, and the other is culture. Education must enable a man to become more efficient, to achieve a legitimate goals in life. Dr. King went on to state, the function of education, therefore, is to teach intensively and critically. But education which stops with efficiency may prove the greatest menace to society. We must remember that intelligence is not enough. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of education. I thank you very much and have a thoughtful evening on what we have learned today and for the rest of the intensive. Thank you.
Our second responder for the session will be Dr. Clyde C. Robertson. He is an associate professor here at Tuskegee University. He earned a Ph.D. in Africana Studies from Temple University and a Master of Arts in Mass Communication Theory from Howard University. He is the author of several articles investigating Africana Studies and history, including Administration of Africana Studies at Black Colleges and African Studies, a disciplinary quest for both theory and method. He is also investigating the impact Hurricane Katrina is having on African Americans. To this end, Dr. Robertson has authored the article, Hurricane Katrina Through the Eyes of African American College Students, The Making of a Documentary, in the Journal of African American History. He has completed the intensive bioethics course at Georgetown University at Washington, D.C., and his book, Africa Rising, Multidisciplinary Discussions on Africana Studies and History. Dr. Clyde C. Robertson.
Madam Superintendent, Mrs. Head, Dr. Warren, brothers and sisters, I offer you my most sincerest greetings and hotep. Bear with me, I'm fighting a cold, so my voice may come and go. In 1919, the Harlem Renaissance writer Claude McKay, responding to the Red Summer, during which no less than 28 African Americans were lynched, penned the following protest limerick. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and pinned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock out of our accused lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What thou before us lays, the open grave? Like men will face the murderous cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. This poem typifies the combative spirit with which African Americans faced the vicious onslaught of racism and intolerance. At the turn of last century, and only a few decades removed from deleterious bondage and enslavement, African Americans pursued value systems inherited from their great ancestors. They created towns, commercial districts, and institutions which all served as buffers from the scorn of white supremacy. Tuskegee University is an example of an institution created by 19th century African Americans as a form of opposition to second-class citizenship. Along with churches, schools provided African Americans with a tangible sense of belonging and security by providing both cognitive instructions and valuable lessons of resistance. Simply learning how to read and write and compute were concrete signs of opposition to those who had, at sword and gunpoint, prohibited these courageous people from pursuing an education. James Anderson, the author of The Education of Blacks in the South, stated that African Americans emerged from slavery with a strong sense and the desirability of learning to read and write. This fact was further substantiated by the following quote uttered by a formerly enslaved person. "There is one sin that slavery committed against me which I will never forgive. It robbed me of my education." And so, soon after emancipation, entire families attended makeshift schools and together struggled to learn. And so, as I grapple with the topic of the school as an extension of family, I'll attempt to do the following. Examine African American education history. Probe the concept of African-centered education and explore the importance of including the family and community in the education of African American youth. At the end of the Civil War, African American freemen and women were found in a land which they had once been enslaved. Very few of them had any recognizable form of education. The vast majority of freemen and women could not read, write, or compute. As a result, newly freed African Americans longed for an education that would allow them to compete and be accepted in a country where they had formerly been scorned, abused, and abandoned. After their emancipation in 1865, many African Americans rushed into the nearest dilapidated makeshift schoolhouse that offered even the slightest academic lessons. During her exploration of the post-war South, Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, observed this phenomenon and wrote the following. "They rushed not to the grog house, but into the schoolroom. They cried for spelling books as bread and pleaded for teachers as a necessity of life." Robert Russa Moton, our own second president, grew up in war-ravaged Virginia. His devotion to education began shortly after his birth in 1867 in Amelia County, Virginia. His oldest memory was of his mother, Emily Brown, working in the field all day and conducting night school in the evening. Among my earliest recollections, recalled Moton, is the fact that my mother frequently, after working in the field all day, would hurry us through the evening ordeal in order to get the cabin ready for the night school, which met regularly in our meager cabin. Moton's mother understood the importance of educating people who had been denied access to the most rudimentary schooling. She viewed education as an essential element to living a free and fulfilling life. This overwhelming commitment to teaching and learning inspired Moton to pursue education as a form of resistance to tyranny, exploitation, and terrorism. The educational self-determination displayed by Emily Brown, Moton's mother, was a common practice among African American people. A major misconception about this period is that the newly emancipated people were totally dependent upon Yankee missionaries for their education. Anderson addressed this point when he said, "The values of self-help and self-determination underlay the ex-slaves' educational movement." He continued, "To be sure, they accepted help from the Northern Missionary Societies, the Freedmen's Bureau, and some Southern whites. But their own action, class self-activity informed by an ethic of mutuality, actually was the primary force that brought schools to the children of free men and women." To accentuate this point, Anderson provided the following quote from William Channing Gannett, a white missionary teacher from New England. He said, "They have a natural praiseworthy pride in keeping their education institutions in their own hands. What they desire is assistance without control." As previously demonstrated, African Americans understood that education was vital to establishing a self-determined and sovereign community, as a result of which both Southern and Northern whites began to impose greater control and influence over African American education. According to Anderson, it is crucial for an understanding of American education to recognize that within American democracy, there have been classes of oppressed people, and that there have been essential relationships between education and the politics of oppression. It was during these post-Civil War years that both Northern and Southern whites became agenda setters and gatekeepers of African American education. Of course, many whites opposed African Americans from obtaining any form of education. However, not all whites were opposed to freedmen and women receiving schooling. Some moderate Southern and Northern whites encouraged a limited and controlled education for African Americans. They believed that universal schooling, according to Anderson, would socialize the young to the discipline and values needed for efficient service within social roles prescribed along race and class lines. And so began in the postbellum South the long African American struggle to define what a meaningful education looks like, what should be taught, and who should control content. The aforementioned challenge continues today. Scholars from Carter G. Woodson to Malefia Sante have struggled with African American educational autonomy and sovereignty. Educators like Naeem Akbar, Joyce King, Wade Nobles, Susan Goodwin continue to ask the following questions. What does a proper education for African American children look like? The aforementioned query is addressed by the concept of African-centered education, curriculum and content. Curriculum and content is at the core of African-centered learning. The historian Carter G. Woodson addressed the necessity of establishing salient academic content for African Americans in his seminal book, The Miseducation of the Negro, in 1933. In this text, he insisted that curricula offered to African Americans should be inclusive and liberating. He strongly suggested that the education most Negroes received, that's the term of that day, Negroes, most African Americans received, was inadequate and inferior. According to Woodson, the educational system as it has been developed in Europe and America does not hit the mark, even for the white man himself. He furthered his diatribe by saying, if the white man wants to hold on to it, let him do so. But the Negro, as far as he is able, should develop and carry out a program of his own. Woodson realized that African Americans had been conditioned to accept neglect and second-class citizenship. As a result, he understood that the average African American's education validated and accentuated his and her woeful status throughout the land. Woodson confirmed his view by positing Negroes daily educated in the tenets of such a religion of the strong have accepted the status of the weak. Woodson continued to connect the plight of African Americans to an abysmal educational system when he suggested no systematic effort towards change has been possible for taught the same economics, history, philosophy, literature, and religion which have established the present code of morals. The Negro's mind has been brought under the total control of the oppressor. In 1933, Woodson, the consummate scholar and historian, stressed the importance of expanding the curricula offered to African Americans. He recognized in people of African descent the harmful psychological impact of having been convinced that neither they nor their ancestors had contributed anything to the world. The same educational process which inspires and stimulates the oppressor with the thought that he is everything worthwhile, Woodson said, depresses and crushes at the same time the spark of genius in the Negro by making him feel that his race does not measure up to the standards of other people. In addition to having identified the negative effects of academic racism on African Americans, Woodson also offered in his seminal text solutions. He suggested that school content include and examine African and African American issues. This back in 1933. To this end, he writes, after Negro students mastered the fundamentals of English and the leading facts into the development of its literature, they should not spend all of their time in advanced work on Shakespeare, Chaucer, and Anglo-Saxons. Woodson asserted they should direct their attention also to the folklore of the African, to the philosophy of his proverbs, to the development of the Negro in the use of language, and to the works of Negro writers. Woodson unapologetically placed the African American student in the center of his and her learning. As a result, he infatuated, inspired, and influenced generations of scholars. Maulana Karenga, Jawanza Kunjufu, Bobby Wright, Francis Cress Welsing, et al., who viewed education as a form of resistance to racism and chauvinism. Molefi Asante, undoubtedly impacted by Woodson's cosmology, has continued to examine the impact of curricula and content on African American students in his textbook, African American History, A Journey of Liberation. He discussed the importance of an African-centered examination of history. It flows from my belief that the records regarding African Americans must be examined from inside the standpoint of an African person. In essence, Africans must be viewed as agents of history, not standing on the fringes of Europe. Asante has asserted that an African American student enjoyment and achievement have increased after having been exposed to an African-centered curriculum. After we rethink and retalk our knowledge of history, focusing now on the African center, Asante said, the joy that inevitably swells up is amazing to me. However, it's important to note that African-centered curricula are more than just feel-good remedies. Schools that have pursued an honest, inclusive curriculum have produced students, especially African Americans, who are successful and competitive. Recently, as recent as September of 2016, the Pimoja, or Together Preparatory Academy opened in St. Louis, Missouri. The aim of this school is to provide a culturally rich and African-centered curriculum to its students. It is one of many schools, both public and private, that stresses an African-centered curriculum. Chicago's Betty Shabazz International Charter School and the Woodlawn Community School in Chicago are learning environments where teachers stretch cultural pride and cultural knowledge as vehicles through which students achieve academic success. At this point, of course, the obvious has to be stated. Not everyone is supportive of the aforementioned approach to teaching African American students. Surprise, right? In a recent New York Times article, Poor Scores Leaves an Afrocentric School in Chicago Vulnerable, John Elligan revealed that these schools had real enemies, whereas supporters of African-themed education see their work as self-empowerment, Elligan asserts. Some others, a number of them in the moneyed, mostly white elite, view these schools as something much more scarier. The University of Texas at San Antonio sociology professor Dr. Teasley, Martell Teasley, agrees with the aforementioned assertion. And he says, and I quote, "Not only can't some of the schools compete financially with larger charters, for example, they are also demonized simply because they are black." Despite these attacks, scholars such as Susan Goodwin in Rochester, New York, continue to encourage the notion that education should be liberating, especially for African American youth. To this end, Goodwin declared that emancipatory pedagogy is a teaching and learning method that empowers students and teachers of color. According to Goodwin, emancipatory pedagogy encompasses all the approaches and practices that are consistent and supportive of the thinking, including what education is and for whom it should serve. Goodwin's assumption is that education should provide the African American student with a sense of self-knowledge and self-realization, which will allow them to establish right relationships with themselves and, as importantly, with others. Emancipatory pedagogy also encourages schools, administrators, teachers, and staff to establish healthy relationships with the students, parents, and community. Adelaide Sanford, in the book Teaching Children of Color, stated that respect and validation of family and community are essential to the rich, meaningful instructional program, one that is productive for children in terms of the fulfillment of life's meaning, not just passing an examination. Administrators who ostracize parents and the community from their school risk creating a major disconnection with many of their students. Teachers and administrators must also develop a healthy connection with and understanding of the community in which the children live. In the community where I live and have taught for 35 years, many teachers did not know anything about the people of African ancestry, said Sanford. So it was absolutely essential to go beyond telling teachers that they had to respect parents and the community. You had to give them examples and experiences that would form the basis for the development of that respect. In many traditional settings, teachers attempted to alter the cultural trajectory of African American students. Educators historically have struggled to make good Americans out of students who invariably practiced their own community's long-established cultural norms. Teachers routinely attempted and currently attempt to correct the neighborhood English that is often spoken by school children. Of course, students must learn how, when, where, and why to use proper English. However, the neighborhood English spoken by the students must not be criticized, which is often a mistake made by many teachers. Sanford addressed this issue when she postulated, unfortunately, too many of the people teaching our children have absolutely no idea that their students' families have cultural traditions, high ethical codes, and established standards of behavior. She further postulated that they are unaware, they meaning the teachers, of the community's rich history and culture that have been kept as an essential element of survival. Teachers must immerse themselves into the total life of their students, which means developing wholesome relationships with families and communities. Joyce King, and yours truly, supported this contention in an article titled Bon Foray, a teaching and learning methodology of healing the wounds of distance, displacement, and loss caused by Hurricane Katrina. The previously mentioned scholars wrote, teachers must be active participants, not just in the use and dissemination of this kind of curriculum content knowledge, but also in its development. King and Robertson also declared, furthermore, creating a cultural community perspective is essential for good teachers and thus good teaching. Sanford, however, stated it more perfectly when she said, so you take what families are, need, know, and are interested in to build a curriculum that enhances your whole school program. In conclusion, for African Americans and other marginalized people, education must be used as a form of resistance and liberation. Historically, schooling has been used to force African Americans into becoming ideal Americans. They were and are encouraged to subscribe to the notion that the only substantial narrative has been written by people of European descent. As a result, African Americans must recapture the educational narrative in a way that properly informs, emboldens, and prepares them to compete as equals in a global setting. This approach must include, in a very meaningful way, the families and communities from which these students come. The great songstress, Dionne Warwick, has best articulated the proper relationship between the schoolhouse, the teacher, and the students and their families in her hit song of 1979, No Nights So Long. She sang as follows. Though it's dark and you have traveled far, every dark night gives you at least one bright shining star. And only now I know what we've been learning all the while, that there's no night so long that you can't find the day, and no day so wrong that you can't find your way. Call on me like you used to do, for I still can show you who and whose you are. Thank you.
At this time, we'll open up for questions and discussion. Anybody has a question? Okay, well, I have a question.
I don't have a mic, but the issue of charter schools, what is your perspective, and others, How's that either support or harm education, particularly for black people?
That's one of those questions that makes you go, Charter schools are all about intent. What is the real intent behind charter school legislation? And so as I look at that in the state of Alabama, and I look at the intent of charter school legislation, that could be very different from its intent in other places like Illinois. I don't think charter school legislation is bad, but much as the professor said, we have to look at who the crafter of the legislation is and why it was crafted. Again, as we look 50 years later at Brown versus the Board of Education, most of our legislative processes are controlled by folks who don't necessarily have the best interest of minority students at heart. And that causes me some great concern, particularly when we assess students by the very curriculum that has been set up that is not culturally relevant, that is mainstream curriculum that in many cases students and communities have rebelled against. And so now we have another gimmick or fix to fix minority education, to fix the poor student, when economic justice and being able to assist and not control, I think, would be a better measure for everyone. But charter schools are, again, an attempt, I think, to control education in a very intentional and particular measure. And when those schools go out, as the Shabazz school that was given in the example did, and bring in those culturally relevant curriculums, then those schools are still then measured by the mainstream assessments, which are inherently culturally biased, and so then the outcome is opposite of what America thinks it should be, and so then those schools are demonized, penalized, and closed, and we're told charters don't work, and then we pull more resources out of that community and then offer another solution, which usually is not a solution for the students in that school anyway. So it's kind of like being on a hamster wheel. You have to, again, follow the money.
If I could follow behind the superintendent. I was an administrator in the New Orleans public school system for nearly 13 years prior to Katrina. It was a fairly strong, much maligned school district of, very many students. I think it was up to 75,000 or down to 75,000, nearing 75,000 when Katrina hit in '05. Many of the schools were neighborhood schools. There were some advanced schools that students outside of communities could apply to and be accepted in. However, it was run by the school board, which was elected by the people. After Katrina, the state of Louisiana, actually, very shortly before Katrina, the state of Louisiana stepped in and took control of the school system and started letting teachers and people go, cutting programs and the like. We were under the auspices of a management firm out of New York. Katrina hit, and then the charter craze began. And what ultimately happened was the privatization of education in the city of New Orleans. Outside firms claimed charters, were given charters. African-American professional teachers were let go, which is why, one of the reasons I'm here, and replaced by young folks from schools all around the country, mainly non-African-American, but not exclusively white. And the whole face of education in the city of New Orleans changed. possibly forever. What is the result of that? A lot of community control of schools no longer exists. Special needs children whose needs were being addressed. There were holes, there were mistakes being made, there was room for growth. But nonetheless, the New Orleans public school system made strides to address the needs of special needs children. Right now, those needs are not being addressed, other than by the small, now mainly truncated New Orleans public school system, which has about 7 schools under its belt. The vast majority of the schools are now chartered. And there is little to no community control. Whatever these corporate structures, many of them are outside Louisiana organizations, whatever they proclaim is what happens. And so centered education, the travel enrichment programs that existed, all of those things no longer exist. And as I stated, the professional African-American educator in large numbers were dismissed. Some have returned. Other younger students from Tuskegee, in fact, are there. My son is one who's now teaching. But the vast majority of tenured black educators gone. What impact has that had on the community? The black political power which existed in the city of New Orleans is now gone, because the majority of the politicized people in New Orleans who were African were educators. And so now even that community has been truncated. So we're talking now about something that goes beyond the schoolhouse. We're talking about the complete impact and the disorientation of an entire city and black community when we talk about charters many times. I don't know how they exist here in Tuskegee or Montgomery or Birmingham, but in the city of New Orleans and in Chicago, that's what's happened.
Do we have another question?
Dr. Brooks, I have a question. I have a 7-year-old, and she's currently in 1st grade, and I always think about what can I do as far as going outside the school to affect, she does go to school, how can I affect her education? And my question is, what can parents do to affect public policy and education and stop things from happening like this Common Core or prescriptions that's getting prescribed to us, but no one is actually engaging us and asking us how we want our children to learn and telling us how they need to learn? How can we affect that?
That's an excellent question, and sometimes I think that as parents and as community members, we forget how our foreparents brought about so much change during the civil rights era and even before. And that was that they lifted their voices and they were engaged in the legislative process to influence policy. And that requires us, are you from Alabama? Are you in Alabama? Okay. But that requires us to be involved in our state legislative processes. And there is a very, very minute number of individuals from the local communities that are involved in that process. And that's actually where everything happens. Most of us talk about it in a reactionary fashion at our city council meetings or in our church groups or what have you, but unless we're at the state house where bills are introduced and laws are passed, we really don't have our voices being heard. And the more parents that have the same vision and the like-mindedness that you do, that you can rally together to have a collective voice and a shared vision to impress upon your elected officials at the state level, the better. Because that is where your bills regarding education, though that's a state's right, education is a state's right, reserved to the states, that you're going to be able to effect the change. For example, if you want to introduce a bill about a particular type of curriculum or a waiver that you would like, it has to happen at the State House in your state where that bill is introduced. And then, of course, if you remember Schoolhouse Rock, you may not be of that era, but with Schoolhouse Rock, how a bill becomes a law, then of course it has to go to the House, it has to go to the Senate, it has to be concurred, and it has to become an act. Most of the things that we hear, charter school legislation, Common Core legislation, sex education, all of those kinds of things are bills that some constituent got introduced or some legislator introduced because it was special to their heart, something happened in their community, they have a particular position or opinion about something, and they got it introduced and rallied enough support so that it becomes a law. When it becomes a law, then we are obligated as public educators who are employed to enforce that law. Sometimes those laws are very opposite of our personal beliefs about what we feel is best for kids and the ways that they learn. But yet it's the law of the land, and we are regulated and required to follow it. So if you get your parent-teacher association, your advisory council of mothers and dads together, and you start writing your legislators, calling them, sending them emails, showing up at their office, knocking on the door, you will get that attention and you will be able to effect change. And if that doesn't work, remind them that you have a vote.
Thank you. Let me address this to Ms. Head. As you are representing Voices for Our Father's Legacy, and oftentimes you hear the men referred to as quote-unquote uneducated. I'd like to hear you talk more about their education and recognizing that education isn't just formal education within a school system or setting, and to be able to just share with us more about that, please.
Thank you. Yes, they are referred to in just about every form that it could possibly be, in the writings and the speeches in the movie and everything, that they were uneducated. When you think of education, you normally think of education in two parts: your formal education and then your education of life, your knowledge, your wisdom that you learn every day. And that is one of the myths that we hope to dispel about the men and the change in the narrative. Yes, they had not, most of them had not had the opportunity to attend a formal education from primary school through high school and on to college. You have to also take under consideration the time and the place and how soon it was after slavery had ended. So the opportunity were not there for most of the men, but the men were very, very well educated in their own right. And we need to understand that. And through telling their stories, hopefully that will start to shine through. Another thing I like to mention, and some of the men, some of the men were able to get an education as far as finishing high school. Tuskegee Institute was here, and some of them came here and went to school, but they lived in the rural area. And not knowing what you were participating in, how could you? And nobody, when they were not informed. I'd like to mention the fact in Booker T. Washington's, and I'm a little passionate about Booker T. Washington, and if I may put in a plug, this year is Find Your Park, because it's the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service. And I don't know how many of you frequent the national parks, But if you don't, start, because they are beautiful places, and they're places that you can really find your history and participate. And so please come, and by all means, come to Booker T. Washington National Monument in Hartford, Virginia, because it's a great place, and you'd be so inspired. And Dr. Warren can attest to that. But Booker T. Washington said when he came to Tuskegee, he would go out into the community, literally be out there with the men and talking to the men, as did Dr. Carver. He said that, and he has a book called My Larger Education. And in his book, he talks about how he learned so much from going and talking and sitting with those men that they call uneducated. So we can learn a lot. Yes, they didn't have the definition that society placed on education, the formal education of going to high school and going on to college and then all of the other degrees to go with it. But they were educated in their own right, and they were intelligent in every right. Thank you.
This concludes our session. I want to thank everyone who's in attendance again.